The Wind in the Willows, Chapter 7, The Return of the Hero, Part 2. When it began to grow dark, the rat proceeded to dress them up for the expedition. There was a belt for each animal, then a sword, a cutlass, a pair of pistols, a truncheon, several sets of handcuffs, bandages and sticking plaster, and a flask and a sandwich case. The badger laughed and said, "All right, Ratty, but I'm going to do all I've got to do here with this stick." But the rat only said, "Please, Badger, I shouldn't like you to say I had forgotten anything." Badger led them along the river for a little way, then suddenly swung himself over the edge into a hole in the riverbank. They were in a secret passage. It was cold and dark and damp and low and narrow. They shuffled along till at last they heard, apparently over their heads, people shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor. "What a time they're having," said the badger. "Come on." They hurried along the passage till they found themselves under a trapdoor. They heaved it back and found themselves standing in the pantry with only a door between them and their enemies. The noise was deafening. A voice could be made out saying, "I should like to say one word about our kind host, Mr. Toad." Great laughter. "Good Mr. Toad, modest Mr. Toad." Shrieks of merriment. "Let me get at him," muttered Toad, grinding his teeth. "Let me sing you a little song," went on the voice, "which I've composed on the subject of Toad." The badger drew himself up, took a firm grip of his stick and cried, "The hour is come, follow me," and flung the door wide open. My, what a squealing and a squeaking and a screeching filled the air. The mighty badger, his whiskers bristling, mole black and grim, rat desperate and determined, Toad frenzied with excitement, emitting toad whoops that chilled them to the marrow. They were all but four in all, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they fled, with squeals of terror, through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of the reach of those terrible sticks. Up and down the hall strode the four friends, whacking with their sticks at every head that showed itself, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. The badger, resting from his labours, leant on his stick and wiped his honest brow. "Mole," he said, "you are the best of fellows. Just cut along outside and see what those stoat sentries of yours are doing. I've an idea that, thanks to you, we shan't have much trouble from them tonight." The mole vanished promptly through a window, and the badger bade the other two see if they could find materials for a supper. "I want some grub," he said, in that rather common way he had of speaking. They were just about to sit down when the mole clambered through the window, chuckling, with an armful of rifles. "It's all over," he reported, "as soon as the stoats, who were very jumpy already, heard the uproar inside the hall. They threw down their rifles and fled. So that's all right." "Excellent and deserving animal," said Badger. So they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valour and a proper handling of sticks. The following morning, Badger remarked, "I'm sorry, Toad, but there's a heavy morning's work in front of you. You see, we really ought to have a banquet to celebrate this affair. It's expected of you. Invitations have to be written, and you've got to write them." "What?" cried the Toad, dismayed. "Me? Stop indoors and write a lot of rotten letters on a jolly morning like this? Certainly not. I'll be—" "Stop a minute, though. Why, of course, dear Badger, it shall be done." Toad hurried to his writing table, A fine idea had occurred to him. He would write the invitations, and he would give a programme of entertainment for the evening with speeches and songs by Toad. The idea pleased him mightily, and he worked very hard and got all the letters finished by noon. A small weasel hurried off to deliver them. But when the other animals came back to lunch, the rat caught Toad by the arm. "Now look here, Toad," he said. "It's about this banquet. I'm very sorry, but we want you to understand that there are going to be no speeches and no songs." Toad saw that he was trapped. They understood him. They saw through him. His pleasant dream was shattered. "Mayn't I sing them just one little song?" he asked piteously. "No, not one," replied the rat firmly, though his heart bled as he noticed the trembling look on the poor, disappointed Toad. "It's for your own good, Toady. You know your songs and speeches are all boasting and vanity. You must turn over a new leaf, sooner or later." Toad remained a long while plunged in thought. At last he raised his head. "You have conquered, my friends," he said. "It was a small thing that I asked. However, you are right. Henceforth I will be a very different Toad. But oh dear, this is a hard world." He left the room with faltering steps. "I feel like a brute," said the rat. "I know," said the badger gloomily, "but would you have him jeered at by stoats and weasels?" "Of course not," said the rat. "And talking of weasels, it's lucky we came upon that little weasel and confiscated Toad's invitations. I had a look at one or two. They were simply disgraceful. Mole is filling up plain, simple invitations now." At last, the hour for the banquet drew near, and Toad was still sitting there, melancholy and thoughtful. His brow resting on his paw, he pondered long and deeply. Gradually, he began to smile. Then he took to giggling. At last he got up, locked the door, drew the curtains, arranged all the chairs in a semicircle, and took up his position in front of them, swelling visibly. Then he bowed, coughed twice, and sang to the enraptured audience that his imagination so clearly saw. Toad's last little song. The Toad came home. There was panic in the parlour and howling in the hall. There was crying in the cowshed and shrieking in the stall when the Toad came home. When the Toad came home, there was smashing in of window and crashing in of door. There was chivying of weasels that fainted on the floor when the Toad came home. When the Toad came home. Bang go the drums, the trumpeters are tooting, the soldiers are saluting, and the cannon they are shooting, and motor cars are hooting as the hero comes. Shout hooray, and let each one of the crowd try and shout it very loud, in honour of an animal of whom you're justly proud, for it's Toad's great day. He sang this very loud, with great unction and expression, and when he had done, he sang it all over again. Then he heaved a deep sigh and went quietly down to his guests. The animals cheered when he entered and crowded round to say nice things about his courage and his fighting, but Toad only smiled faintly and murmured, "Not at all," or, "On the contrary, Badger was the mastermind. The Mole and the Water Rat bore the brunt of the fighting. I merely served in the ranks and did little else." The animals were puzzled by this unexpected attitude of his, and Toad felt, as he made his modest responses, that he was an object of absorbing interest to everyone. At intervals he stole a glance at the badger and the rat, staring at each other with their mouths open, and this gave him the greater satisfaction. When later there were cries of "Toad! Speech! Song!" Toad only shook his head and raised a paw in mild protest. He was indeed an altered toad. After this climax, the four animals continued to lead their lives in great contentment. Sometimes in the course of a long summer evening, the friends would stroll together into the wild wood, now tamed, and it was pleasing to see how respectfully they were greeted by the inhabitants, and how the mother weasels would say to their young ones, "Look, baby, there goes the great Mr. Toad, and that's the gallant water rat with the famous Mr. Mole." But when their infants were fractious, they would quiet them by telling them how, if they didn't hush, the terrible grey badger would come and get them. This was a base libel on Badger, who was rather fond of children, but it never failed to have its full effect. The end.